Today we're going to talk about my specialty A, which is qualitative interviewing. Okay? And there's really 3 types of qualitative interviews that we're going to discuss. And then you're going to have to make your own interview guide. Yes! You are! And then it'll be time to move on to the next thing. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I'm drinking tea, A. So, qualitative interviewing. So, what's the difference here? Well, qualitative research is much more about finding richness in meaning, right? But you can't really generalize from it. So, it's much more of a, what people call a naturalist approach, right? Where you go into the field, you go boots on the ground, right? Talking to people, observing people, learning from people, but you're not getting a big overhead view. You're getting you're seeing what things look like on the ground, which has its own merits, right? You get to see you get to see what's happening for realsies, as opposed to just surveying a bunch of people and sort of hearing what they all think, right? You get to go there. The nice thing about qualitative research is that if you're not, so with all these other research, or with many of these other research designs, right? You have to, it's deductive. You have to anticipate something, right? You have to base something in theory. You have to know what's going on already to make your questions, right? That you then disperse to people. But with qualitative interviewing, with qualitative research, if you're boots on the ground, you're interviewing people, you're observing people, and you find something new, you can then write about it or learn more about it. You can change things on the cuff. Whereas you can't necessarily do that with survey research or with experiments, right? Those are too rigid. But the nice thing about their rigidity is that you can generalize from them. Whereas with qualitative interviews and qualitative observations, which is going to be topic 9, you can't. Okay? Is that okay? Can you handle that? Can you handle that? I hope you can. I hope you can. The nice thing, so in reality though, oftentimes when we do conduct qualitative research, we also have some sort of a quantitative component to it. So when I conduct research, my bread and butter is qualitative interviews, but I also usually give a survey. Like, remember the survey we just looked at in topic 7? I usually combine those with observation. So I have 3 ways of collecting data at one place. That way you can, if you don't understand something, like oftentimes what happens is on my survey, like I'll get some finding that says, where officers are like, well, I use body cameras all the time when I'm writing my reports, but yet at the same time it says it hasn't changed the way I write my reports, right? So that's what I get from the survey, but you get no more explanation from that. And you're like, what the hell does that mean? That seems like a contradiction. Why is it a contradiction? Is there something wrong with my survey instrument, right? Then you go to the qualitative interviews, and the interviews show, it hasn't really changed the way that they write their reports. It's just they look at the footage when they're writing the reports for certain types of cases that are very complex for them, right? So they look at their body camera footage when they're dealing with something like a use of force or a DUI, right? A thing that was complex, where a lot of steps happen, where your report needs to be 100. Okay, so the structure of your report is still the same, but the amount of detail that they now have from the video, that is now included into the video. So it doesn't change the way you write your reports, but you do use body camera footage a lot when you're writing reports. So in this case, when you mix methods together, you can get a more all-around picture, right? So my survey data gave me some numerical data, gave me some quantitative data about reporting practices and body cameras, but my qualitative interviews gave me that context to help me understand it, right? It gave me richness of meaning and deep knowledge, stuff that you can't just get straight from quantitative research. So what happens more often than not, and it's very frustrating for me as someone who is primarily a qualitative researcher, is that other criminal justice scholars tend to scoff at qualitative research, right? They see it sort of as like, it's like that little black sheep, right? It's like in a family of lawyers, the one lawyer that decided to go public defender, right? So, and it's cool, man. I understand completely why people look down on qualitative research, because you can't generalize from it. You can't draw statistical significance from it, right? And it lends itself to a lot of interpretation by the researcher. So it's, to an extent, it can be less objective, but it also gives us new meaning. It gives us a look into processes, things that you can't study with quantitative and nomothetic designs. So yeah, I get where they're coming from. Should we discount or disqualify or dismiss qualitative research? No, you should not. It is important as well. I get quantitative research gives us more outcomes-based knowledge. It gives us a wider, it gives us a much more overhead view on things, and that's why you should never ever say that qualitative research is better than quantitative research. But I don't think you should either say that quantitative research is necessarily the only thing that we need to rely on. So when you're a qualitative researcher, when you write your articles, you have to be very careful, and you have to get used to being rejected a lot. Like oftentimes I've had articles rejected mainly because the reviewer said it's qualitative, you can't generalize from it. Yeah, well, I said that in my article, bro. Okay, so calm your ish. All right. So some people, it's just like it's just an easy way to get another review on your CV, and not have to do a lot of work. Oh, it's qualitative. I'll just complain about the research methods. I'll just pull some research methods limitations out of a textbook, write that down, reject it, and then it shows that I did professional service, and then I don't have to actually read this article. Okay, so what are qualitative interviews? Well, qualitative interviews are having a chat. You're having a chat with someone. You want to learn about them, right? Think about a time, something that I noticed when I first went to college. I remember when I first went to college, right, I went to high school, and in high school, you're the person you are then, and then when you go to college, none of that stuff comes with you, right? So you're like a new person when you're in college, right? And so you meet new people, and, there's not all the mistakes you made in high school and what people think of you are no longer with you. And so, I remember going to a party my freshman year in college. I was maybe like my second week at college. I went to a party. It was like a frat party. It was stupid. But nonetheless, I meet this dude. He was from Southern Virginia. I was from Northern Virginia. And he was like, "Hey, man." They all have accents there, by the way. It's like, "Hey, man, where are you from?" "Well, I'm from D.C." "Like Washington, D.C.? "Yeah." He's like, "Wow, man, I went there once for like a 6th grade, blah, 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 blah." And then he ended up asking me all these questions, and he learned a lot about me, right? He's like, "You got a weird accent." It's like, "Yeah, well, I was born in South Africa, and then I moved to..." "What, South Africa? How in the hell are you white?" Right? And I was like, "Well, yeah, you have white people who went to South Africa, and then they did all kinds of crappy things to the people there, and blah, 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 blah." Right? And so this guy asked me all these questions, and he got to learn from me. And then I reciprocated. I asked him, "Well, what's your deal?" "Well, I used to live in Mississippi, blah, 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 blah." Right? And you learn about these people. You learn, and you learn about their life story. You learn about why they think about things. You learn about their politics, blah, 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 blah. Right? That is what an interview is. An interview is sort of having that first conversation with someone when you meet them and just learning about them. Now, it's different from when you're having a casual conversation like the one I just had, because you have a general plan that you want to talk about, right? My main focus in research right now is police technology. So because the hot technology right now is body cameras, I've been interviewing police officers about body cameras, right? So I sit there and I chat with them, and I'm like, "Hey, tell me about your thoughts regarding body cameras. How has it changed your behaviors? Blah, 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 blah." Right? So the way to think about qualitative interviews is that you have a general purpose. You want to learn as much as you can because you don't really know much about it. So this is really good for descriptive and exploratory research, right? We don't really know much about how body cameras have changed the way that people do policing, right? So you know what you want to talk about in general. right? And now you're going to have this conversation with someone. So oftentimes we learn, so with descriptive research, with quantitative research, we often learn what and why, right? And you can also learn those things with qualitative research, but with qualitative things, we learn the how, the processes. How do you do this? How have body cameras changed the way that you supervise or the way that you behave or the way that you talk to citizens? For instance, one way that I learned how body cameras have changed the way that police officers talk to citizens is that they use less sarcasm, or they exercise this thing called verbal caution, where they're like, They pretend, they know that someone's going to watch or they feel like someone's going to watch their footage later. So when they talk to the people, they talk to them as if there's an audience there. That's how body cameras have changed the way that officers behave. But can a survey necessarily find that without knowing that at first? No. But what the survey now can do is, knowing that, the survey can now probe, a survey can now be sent out to many officers to find out about, well, what type of verbal caution do they exercise, and then what other demographic factors are associated with that. So where I can say, where with qualitative research I can find a new variable, quantitative research can then say, well, actually this variable that was found is much more associated with people who are conservative than people who are liberal, or people who have more experience in policing than people who don't, right? So qualitative research has its purposes and it has its qualities, but quantitative research also is useful, right? So both of these need to be used in order for us to further knowledge. So you should never look down on one, and unfortunately there's people with freaking PhDs that do. All right, so when do we use qualitative interviews? Well, when we want to learn about the perspectives of people. We want to learn about people's perspectives. It gives us first account knowledge, so people who've lived in those shoes, like police officers, criminals, right? So think about the assignment that you have to do about prostitutes, right? How do you learn about why prostitutes wanted to use Craigslist or the internet to advertise their services? Well, you interview them and you ask them questions, right? And the qualitative interviews allow you to get a little more flexibility to really find out and probe after things. Right? How do people feel about their identities and roles and purpose in life? Those are things that are much more difficult to get at with survey research if you don't already have some sort of an idea what's going on, right? So if you are just trying to further explain things, yeah, maybe then you can use a survey. Or if you're trying to further describe things, or to say how many of people believe that their purpose in life is X, Y, Z, yeah, great. Survey research is good for that. But if we don't know how people view their purpose in life, right, before you give that survey, then you need to go do interviews. You need to go find out. So again, the purpose of interviews are to find new variables, or to describe processes, or do things, or describe or explain things that, or explore things that are not well known yet. All right, so there's 4 types of qualitative interviews that we're going to cover. A structured interview consists of like predetermined, written down questions, and it's very rigid. You want to read every single question to the respondent verbatim. So each respondent hears the exact same questions read in the exact same way, in the exact same order. All right, so it is very rigid, but the nice thing about that is it is consistent. Right? Everybody hears the same question, everybody answers the same question, and in the same order, so you have a lot more reliability when it comes to that. So a semi-structured interview is when you have standardized questions, but it allows you to go off the cuff if needed. So if you're asking someone a question about something, let's say you ask someone, how old were you when you used drugs the first time? Well, I used, I remember drinking for the first time when I was 12 years old, and then getting drunk, and I and I threw up. And I don't know, I remember that despite that, it still felt really good while I was drunk. I remember the more I drank, or when I drank, I was able to be more loose. Like I could say what I meant. Like I had the courage to say what I meant to people, and I really enjoyed being around people, and especially with women, I became very, very confident around them, right? So when you're using a semi-structured interview, when someone mentions something kind of interesting, you can sort of go off the path again and then come back to things, right? Also, you don't have to have things in any particular order with a semi-structured interview. With a structured interview, things have to be in order, and when someone is done talking about a certain topic, you move on to the next question. You don't necessarily do a lot of probing with structured interviews. But with a semi-structured interview, you can probe, and you can sort of go off the beaten path, and you can sort of ask things out of order depending on how you feel a situation. Right? When I interview police officers about body cameras and stuff, like there's some officers that you notice that they're not completely comfortable talking to you yet. One thing that you learn if you ever become a criminal justice researcher is that police officers are extremely suspicious of us. I mean, they all thought I was there because I was the chief's little henchman and I was gonna get them in trouble if they said anything negative about body cameras. And so I spent a lot of time just sort of shooting a breeze with them, getting them to trust me, right? And then there was some officers, you want to wait before you ask certain questions or go down certain paths, because if they're not comfortable with you yet, they're not going to talk about that stuff, right? They're just going to give you bullshit answers. So, semi-structured interviews, you have structure because you know I need to talk about these 10 topics before I end this interview. But with an unstructured interview, you're seriously just chatting about anything, right? You might know I want to talk about body cameras, but you can let that conversation go any way you want. It can derail as much as you want, right? So the nice thing with structured interviews is that they are, so you're going to make sure that everyone answers the exact same question in the exact same order. So you can draw a lot of parallels. There's a lot more consistency. With semi-structured interviews, you have some of that consistency, but not quite as much. But you also get a little bit more additional information that you didn't necessarily anticipate would be important. But with unstructured interviews, you can have one interview that is like an hour and a half long, another one that's 20 minutes long, and one that talks about maybe the causes behind someone's drug use, whereas the other one talks about maybe friends that they've lost due to drug use. So there's a lot of varying, but you can probably get a lot of in-depth information from that. So each type of interview has its merits, but they all have their limitations as well. I personally prefer semi-structured interviews. And then a focus group is when you're doing an interview with like 6 to 12 people, all right, all at once. And so this is where you're discussing something with people in a group, and you get to guide that discussion. So you can have an unstructured focus group, you can have a semi-structured focus group, or a structured focus group, right? I would say, again, the most important thing would be a semi-structured focus group. The only difference here is that with these types of interviews, you're talking to one person. With these types of interviews, you're talking to 6 to 12 people. All right? Let me show you an example of a semi-structured interview guide that I use. This is from my dissertation. Whoops-a-daisy. Clickety-clack. So this is from my dissertation. As you can see, I last saved it in 2015, man. It's a long time ago. That was a good year, 2015. I got a dog. Lived in a nice apartment outside of DC. Didn't have a kid yet. Had a lot more time. I remember playing Witcher 3. Great video game. Man, those were the days. Now here I am talking to you lot. No, it's cool. Okay. So in the interest of, so what I would do is I'd print out one of these each time I went to go talk to someone. Now, some semi-structured interview guides are not quite as detailed as mine sometimes. So here I had 4 general topics or 5 general topics I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about some background stuff. I wanted to talk about how they viewed the technical aspects of body cameras. I wanted to talk about how they viewed the implementation of body cameras. And I wanted to talk about how they use the day-to-day use of body cameras. And then I also wanted some examples. Like, one thing, let me tell you this. If you're ever going to interview a cop, tell them to tell you a story. Cops love stories, man. They love to tell stories. Oh, man, one time there was this guy, he was butt naked. But yeah, so cops like to tell stories. And so you always want to ask for examples. Can you tell me about an example when blah, blah, blah? Because they would really expand on that. And oftentimes you get a lot of latent content from that. And I'll explain to you what that is. But anyways, here is a semi-structured interview, right? And so I would write down the officer's de-identified ID number. So like I would have like A1 was the officer's name, right? That way there's that confidentiality is ensured, right? I say where the interview occurred, the date of the interview, and then I'd have an interview number, and then I write the start time and the end time, right? And so I always wanted to have a little bit of script, and I want you to do the same for your interview guide assignment that you have to make your mock interviews, right? Have script, because the reason why I have, so with semi-structured interviews, you don't necessarily have to have script. With structured interviews, you do, but with semi-structured, you don't necessarily. But I like to, because I often strike blank, right? Especially when I'm like in front of like cops, like, because they make me nervous. I'm like, are you gonna arrest me? Right? So when I go blank or when I get nervous, I just look down at the paper and I read, right? Thank you for participating in this study. The purpose of this interview is to learn about your experiences and views about body-worn cameras. I think that police professionals may have different views on this topic. I would like to learn as much as possible from your insights. Please be as detailed as possible. Now, first, I'm going to start with some background questions. How long have you been a police officer? Right? So here I have these bolded things are the general topics I want to get through, but then in order to help myself, I've added individual questions, right? In order to just make sure I remember I cover everything properly. So when you look at this piece of paper, you could say this is pretty much a structured interview, but what would make this a structured interview is if I asked each officer each question verbatim and did not allow them to go talk about something over here first, right? Because what happens a lot is you ask an officer, how long have you been using a body camera? And they're like 10 years, and yeah, I remember they implemented these things because they wanted to blah, 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 right? So all of a sudden, they answered this question for you and they jumped over here. So with a structured interview, you would want to drive them back to this, right? But with a semi-structured interview, you just let it go. You're like, all right, cool. Okay, I know they've talked about this. And then you might want to probe further and then move on, right? So the structured interview, you're not allowed to have that flexibility. With the semi-structured interview, you do. And that is what I like to do. One thing that you can notice here already, so remember with surveys, right, you ask the background questions last. Here you ask them first, and I'll explain explain that to you later. Okay, so now you've seen an example, and I'll come back to this example. Ooh, chocolate. Do you guys like chocolate? I like dark chocolate, but I don't like Hershey's. And I used to like Cadbury. Now I don't like Cadbury because Hershey makes Cadbury now. So now I eat the Ghirardelli. Is that what they call it? Ghirardelli? Whatever. It's delicious. So conducting. Oh my gosh. I have a typo. It says ex-maple instead of example. I'm going to leave it as ex-maple to remind you of what an imperfect person I am. I'm a failure. I'm useless. Horrible instructor. And here is an example of my horribleness. Here it is. Ex-maple. That's all I am. I'm an ex-maple. Now I will cross it out with yellow. All right. So you can do them on the phone, you can do them online, but that's weird. Most of the time you do them in person, right? You talk face to face. And one of the most important things to do is to develop rapport, right? Especially in criminal justice research. If you're interviewing anyone that is involved in the administration of justice, they are going to not want to talk to you really because they work for the government. Remember, if you are not a cop or a criminal, they see you as a know-nothing. Someone from the public who doesn't know what they're talking about. They're just looking for trouble. So they already don't like you. They already don't want to talk to you. So you got to make sure you break down those barriers. It is very important to establish rapport with people. Because once you have someone that's comfortable with you, they're much more willing to share with you. And you do that by just sort of having a bit of a chat for like 5 to 10 minutes. You know, in my experience as a qualitative researcher, there's been times where I had like a 30-minute long conversation with someone before we started the interview. All right, you just have to win their trust. So one thing that I often do is, especially with police officers, let me show you. I don't mean to like show you all my cards. What? No, discard. Okay. So usually right here with the how many years have you been a patrol officer, or which police assignment have you spent the most time? That question is my money question, because what usually happens there is some officer will be like, well, I did about 10 years in K-9. And you're like, K-9? Really? Tell me a little bit about K-9. How does that work? Do you have to pay for all of your dog's food? Like, is it your dog? Do you keep it? Yes, I keep the dog. And so, do you pay for it? Like, is it just on you now? Do they just give you this thing and they're like, here's a pet. By the way, it's on you. Vet bills and everything's on you. And they're like, no, the city pays for it, or they reimburse me, blah, 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 blah. Right? So, it makes them feel like you're genuinely interested in them, that you're not just there to get information from them, right? And you just ask them, right? I mean, who doesn't like being asked questions? So, reflexivity is a little complex. So I'll try to explain this to you. So, when you are interviewing someone, there's a power dynamic there. It depends on who you're interviewing, when you're interviewing them, and what you're interviewing them about. There's always a asymmetrical sort of power dynamic there. And so the meaning that, so when someone says, body cameras are difficult to use, right? That sentence to them might have different meaning than that sentence has for me, the interviewer. So whenever we are in any sort of conversation, human beings bring their own way of interpreting what someone else is saying to them, right? People bring their own meaning to or subjectivity to information that they receive. All right? And so reflexivity is thinking back on that information that you're receiving, and how did your own subjectivity interfere with the way that you interpreted that. So making sure that your subjectivity does not cause you to interpret things differently than it should, right? Because in the end, right, you are a researcher. You have a lot of knowledge about a certain topic. And so when someone says something to you, it's easy to just, put them in a category, right? But you wouldn't have done that if you hadn't already had that knowledge, or your subjectivity helped you, caused you to interpret that thing the way you did. And it might be correct at that point, but it might also not be. So reflexivity is about being aware of the meaning that you brought to information. So when you receive information, so when someone says, body cameras are implemented because the chief wanted to catch us doing wrong, right? So I might say, oh, that officer views body cameras as a accountability mechanism. Is that really how that officer mentions it? Or how that officer interprets it? The officer mentioned that the cameras were implemented because the chief wanted to catch them doing wrong, right? So, but because of the way that I have read body camera research, I'd be like, aha, they see this as an accountability mechanism. But that might not be right. It might be the officer who said that might have said so differently, right? Or what they meant by that might have meant something different than it is just an accountability mechanism. They might have meant more, this is a gotcha mechanism, right? There's a difference between being held accountable and being hunted down. So the meaning that I took from that and the meaning that they said isn't the same. And that's my fault because of my subjective reality that I interpreted that. Now, at the same time, you also have to think, how does my relationship with the interviewee impact how this interviewee is going to share things? Maybe the interviewee sees me as one of the chief's henchmen, one of the chief's little minions, and now they're just discussing all of their complaints about the body cameras with me because they think I'm going to go back to the chief and tell the chief, hey, officers are really unhappy with this. So they're focusing much more on the negative stuff. Or the way they frame things is, oh, this guy's going to go to the chief and he's going to give the chief feedback. Or they frame things in a way where it's like, this guy's going to tell the chief everything I said, so I'm going to be careful. Right? So the reflexivity is when I think on what were the dynamics in that interview? How should I be interpreting this information? Because the thing is, the way information is interpreted always falls on the researcher. And we have to be careful of what we bring into it and the dynamics that exist in this situation. So reflexivity is very important. We must be very careful of it. So focus groups are oftentimes, you oftentimes do those when you are trying to explore things. You're trying to generate a new hypothesis. You're trying to learn something. You can learn how people create their opinions. You can get a quick snapshot of, well, is this a popular opinion or not? Like if you're sitting in a focus group and one person's like, oh man, I really love the battery life of these body cameras. And like everyone looks at them and is like, are you freaking crazy? Right? It allows you to sort of see how a group of people feel about a thing, right? Because when you're talking to an individual, you might see how people feel about things privately, and think about it yourself. There's certain things that you think about privately that you don't share with even your closest friends, right? And if you were to ask that in private, you would be truthful, but if you were to be sitting there in front of your friends, you would answer that question differently, right? Think of something embarrassing. Let's think. What is something embarrassing that is not super inappropriate? A good example. Eating Taco Bell. Yes. Maybe during an interview, I would be much more truthful about exactly how much Taco Bell I can eat in one sitting, right? You know, I might during an interview be like, yeah, I can freaking eat 9 cheesy gordita crunches, right? No problem. But if I'm sitting in front of other people that I work with, maybe in a group, I might be like, yeah, I eat about 3 cheesy gordita crunches. That's about as much as I can do, right? Because it's embarrassing if you were to tell them the truth, right? So the reason why focus groups are good then is we learn how do groups of people feel about things. And so especially when you're doing individual interviews and focus group interviews, you can learn how people feel about things in a group, right? Because in the end, when people are working together in an organization, right, that group mentality is really the thing that runs the show. It's not so much always the individual perceptions that runs behavior or that dictates behavior. So there is definitely a use for focus groups, and focus groups give us that insight into groupthink, right? You can either create your own groups. You can be like, oh, I want a person who has this type of background, a person who has that type of background. Or you can be like, hey, let's take all of the third shift, second squad patrol officers and interview them together, right? I don't know. Or let's interview all the canine people together. So they can be natural groups or they can be artificial groups. The nice thing about natural groups are that they have an existing connection, so you can really get insights into that group think. But with artificial groups, right, you can probe at certain specific things that you might be interested in, and you might be able to get a more diverse response set, right? Especially if you're just doing focus groups to create things, to create maybe interview guides, or maybe to create survey instruments. So when you're conducting a focus group, you must decide, first of all, what am I going to do? Am I doing natural or artificial groups? You need to decide, right? You need to be careful to not let certain people dominate. Have you noticed in class maybe there's usually like one student that always does all the talking, that's always willing to do the talking, and the rest of you just sort of sit there? Well, guess what? That also happens in focus groups. There's always that one person who's very willing to talk. And what sometimes happens is that people will agree with that person. They'll be like, yeah. And so that one person, they dictate how that whole focus group goes. And then people who might not feel this extreme about maybe the battery life of body cameras might then become super extreme about it because someone else has brought that up and someone else is hyping that up. So you have to be careful of controlling those people who tend to be natural dominant members. And one thing you must be careful about is unfortunately with focus groups, you have to be careful about how sensitive of information you're sharing. Right? I gave that example earlier about the amount of Taco Bell that you're willing to eat and how much you're willing to share, how much you're willing to share the truth with people about exactly how much Taco Bell you can house, right? So you have to ensure confidentiality, but you have to try to, but it's not always the case, right? Because if 10 people participate in your focus group and you're like, hey, everybody, the researcher, am keeping things confidential, but Bob, who was in that focus group, going to be walking around to their coworkers and saying, well, I heard Jill, she said she could eat freaking 8 cheesy gordita crunches. Isn't that crazy? Me and a friend did a challenge once where we both got a 12 party pack, like the 12 pack of soft tacos from Taco Bell, to see if we could crush it in 30 minutes, and we both did. He won, though. He did it faster than me. I felt like crap. I felt so sick afterwards. It was bad. But yeah, there's only so much Taco Bell that you can eat. But yeah, so you can't always ensure confidentiality. You want to try to, but I mean, sheesh. So focus groups have that major limitation to them, but it gives you insight into, especially if you conduct interviews and focus groups together, you can sort of see, well, how does someone express things when they're by themselves, and how do they express things in a group, right? And I can remember this. I did an interview at a police agency, and this one officer was telling me how much they hated Donald Trump, right? But they also said at the same time, they're like, I would never ever admit that to my coworkers. He's like, I would be completely shunned because everyone else loves Trump. Isn't that interesting? And when you do focus groups and individual interviews at the same time, you can get at that. When you conduct an interview, right, you want to know someone's story, right? You want to know what is their story. And so you have to figure out how are you going to pull that story out of them. Do you want something that's in synchrony? Do you want a synchronic framework? Do you not really care about what the time frame is? You'll put it together. It's kind of like that movie Memento, where you sort of learn what happens over time. Or is it, do you want a diachronic story? Do you want a story that's chronologically delivered to you, right? And how you set up your questions then will help you figure that out. So if you want something that's very structured and chronologically explained to you, you'd probably want to go with a structured interview. If you want something more if you want something more synchronic, you can go with a unstructured interview. And the semi-structured interview will get you somewhere in between. Again, I like the semi-structured because they give you some framework, but it's not too rigid where you're losing proper information. Probing is important, right? Sometimes people say something that's sort of like, whoa, and then you wanna go after it, right? Other times people just don't want to talk, and you get that so much with police officers, and it's so frustrating with them, right? They're like, yeah. I'm like, dude, I didn't even ask you a yes or no question. I asked you how. I'll be like, tell me, how long does it take you to put on your body camera? 10 seconds. All right. So would you then say that's pretty easy, or would you say it's difficult? It's easy. And so would you compare that to, other equipment? Like, what other equipment do you have to put on? Well, I have my taser, I have my OC spray, I have my little baton thing, I have my weapon. So in what order do you put all this stuff on? Well, the way I do it is blah, 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 right? So by just probing, asking more questions, at some point someone is going to be like, all right, I'll freaking talk, right? You just got to probe. Oftentimes what I do is I'll ask people, like, can you explain that a little further for me? Sorry, I don't know what you mean, right? Nodding helps, leaning in, seeming like you really care, asking someone to clarify. What I sometimes do is I will, after they say something to me, I'll be like, okay, so the way I understand this, and I'll on purpose explain it the wrong way for them, so that they like, no, that's not what I meant, and then they go and they explain everything to me way more clearly, right? I do that often. There's so many times, if you read my interview scripts, and then they would explain things to me much more carefully. But you also have to be careful how much you do that. You don't want them to think that this guy is just zoning me out, right? So you want to know when to use that. But lean in, seem like you actually care, right? Ask them to clarify. But probes are great, especially when they're saying something like that you didn't expect would come out, and you can jump after it. Getting access is difficult, all right? Whether they're criminal justice people or whether they're criminals, there's this outsider status, right? That it's just difficult. Police officers, if you're not a cop, they don't think you know anything about anything. And so I know I'll never be an insider with them, but you can, by the way you build a rapport, you can get access to them, right? And you can have them trust you, and then they will share some information with you. With the problem with like prostitutes or people that are like criminals, right? It's even much more difficult, especially when you tell them you're a criminal justice researcher. They think you're a freaking cop, right? So building rapport with them is very, 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 very important. So I remember when I got a local police agency to do interview with them, I started off just inviting officers to my classes to come talk to my classes. I went to a bar that I know that a lot of officers went to. I went to different events where I got to meet the different command staff, right? And then I got people's emails. I started corresponding with them. And then I was like, hey, can I chat with you guys? Can I do this research? Yeah, sure. Right? So it takes time to gain access to these people. So it's difficult. It takes time and patience. So some ways you can build rapport is show respect, be honest, right? Play innocent, pay attention to what people are saying, listen to them, right? Ask them for for examples, right? You're learning from them. You know, it's like pretend you're the guy at the party asking someone questions, right? They like to, questions they like to talk about, right? So be careful. Be respect. I think respect, especially when it comes to criminals and cops. It's so funny because it's criminals and cops. As long as you show respect, that goes a long way. Respect goes a long way with cops and with criminals.